Maura, you're very welcome back to the ScaleX Insider podcast. I'm really delighted and thrilled to have you on the show today.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here, Brendan. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, we were speaking. There's only, I think, 3 guests have been invited back. In season 2, episode 4, I think it was, very early on, your episode really gained the listener's ear as we talked about all things productivity and attention management. So I'm really excited about releasing and bringing to our audience today your new book. Before we get into that, our vision is to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of small and medium-sized enterprises to scale with purpose. So Maura, what does scaling with purpose mean to you?
It means creating an intentional culture that is focused on being purposeful about what the environment of your company is like, because a lot of cultures are created and companies have missions and they have visions, but really the culture is formed by how people behave and how people interact with each other. And oftentimes we don't realize that the way we behave is super disruptive to other people. And it comes from a good place, but it really does undermine the culture. And so that's what scaling with purpose means to me.
Excellent. I was delighted when you sent me an early copy of your wonderful new book, Everyone Wants to Work Here, because it speaks directly to the 10th principle of our ScaleX framework, positive growth culture, where in your book, you explore the secrets of creating a highly desirable workplace. What inspired you to write the book? Because we were chatting before we started to record, and I was asking you, do you enjoy writing? You said, only when I have something to say. So what did you feel? What were you burning to say in this book that you hadn't said before, hasn't been said before?
Yeah, I think that the most underrated problem, I think, for professionals globally, and the most underrated problem for businesses globally, especially smaller businesses, I believe, is distraction. And we are not, I think it's the biggest and most underrated, because we somehow are operating under this principle of this is the way the world is. And this is the way we have to act, and we have no choice in the matter. Like, this is just, it's fast paced, it's always on, it's super disruptive, but go, 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 that's what it requires, right? This is how we need to behave. And I reject that premise, and I invite my clients to reject it as well. And so that's really sort of the chapters of the book are about all the different ways that distraction is undermining culture and making employees exhausted and stressed out and burned out, and creating a culture where everybody goes home at the end of the day and says, oh my gosh, I was busy all day and I'm exhausted and somehow I got nothing done. Instead of going home at the end of the day and saying, oh my gosh, that was such a good day, I got so much done. And just imagine if everybody went home at the end of the day saying, that was such a good day, I got so much done. What would that mean, not only for the employees, but for the business? It would be unstoppable. So that was what I was burning to say with this book.
Yeah, that's so profound. I was reading a report this morning from Gallup. It was a report that they'd issued only 4 weeks ago, and it cites that at least 50% of the US workforce are quietly quitting. Can you share with us, for those who are not familiar with that concept, what quietly quitting is, and what do you think is at the root cause of the quietly quitting?
Yeah. So honestly, Brendan, I think that this idea of quiet quitting is sort of business propaganda. So quiet quitting is portrayed as a whole bunch of lazy people trying to do the bare minimum and get away with it.
Yeah.
I feel like that's what people think quiet quitting is. That's what quiet quitting has been portrayed as.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sick of this and my company doesn't appreciate me, and I'm just going to do as little as I can and hope nobody catches me, and I'm going to make sure nobody catches me. And I think that is bull. I have never met any professional. I mean, I'm sure there are, right? I'm sure there are people in this world who, right? But that is absolutely not the majority of professionals, at least in my experience. Most professionals I know work hard and want to do a good job and want to continue to work hard. I wrote an article for Forbes called "Why Leaders Should Want Their Employees to Quiet Quit." And so here's what I really think quiet quitting is. And that is, I am going to put some boundaries. I'm not going to let work rule my life anymore. I'm going to start taking better care of myself so that I can do a better job at work. I'm going to start taking the downtime that I really need to do a good job. I'm going to stop neglecting my family at the expense of my work, right? It's a realization that knowledge workers, especially, right? People who sit at a desk and use a computer to do their jobs. I think it's the realization that we are better at our jobs when we are not constantly go, stressed out, always on. Just this culture of urgency that companies create is not conducive to high quality knowledge work. And I think quiet quitting is that realization.
There has been a real blurring of boundaries between kind of work and personal life since the pandemic. You know, whilst working from home has brought so many advantages in terms of negating the need to travel long distances and the flexibility that has actually enabled people to enjoy. It has also encouraged a lot of informal communications, and I'm guilty of this, you know, WhatsApping, emailing, voicemail messages, you know, at any time of the morning, night, day, weekend. And that all seems to be acceptable now. What has that done, firstly, in your experience, to productivity levels? And what should we do to counteract that, if anything?
Yeah. So there's really two sides of the coin when we're looking at this, right? When we think about individuals, right? Leaders too, but people as individuals and people as employees of the company, because leaders are still employees of the company, right? When we think about people, I believe it is absolutely true that we need to be in control of our own. Like, if you text somebody at 6 a.m, it shouldn't wake them up, because they should have their phone on silent if they're sleeping, right? Or like, if you allow technology to distract your life, that is on you, because nobody can give you work-life balance, right? That is 100% true. And also, if you are a leader, you have to realize that if you are reaching out to somebody after hours, that is like saying to them, I hope you have a good night. Like, go home, enjoy, have a great night. I'm going to want to tell you something later. I mean, don't worry about it, but I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to need to tell you something later. But have a great night. Right? If your boss says that to you, how are you feeling in that moment, right? No, tell me now. Tell me now. What is it? What do you want to tell? What is it? Is it good? Is it bad? Did I drop the ball? Am I getting promoted? Like, what is it? Just tell me. And so it doesn't matter if you are the boss and you are communicating with someone after hours, they want to know what you're saying to them. Right? They want to know what that communication is about. And so there's this idea of anticipatory stress, right? I think the boss might message me tonight. So I wonder what that's going to be about. And I'm going to keep checking to see what that's going to be about. And not only, the research has shown that not only does the employee have anticipatory stress, but the whole family has anticipatory stress. Because when you think about it, if you have a family at home, they're excited for you to get home, and we can, like, have dinner together, and we can play games, and we can watch a movie, and we can go ride our bikes, and we can take a walk around the neighborhood, and we can do whatever we're going to do this evening, unless mom gets the call from work or dad gets the email, and then they're going to have to work, and we don't get to do those things anymore. So that's, I think, really the problem. I'm sorry, now I've even forgotten the question that prompted this line. Oh, quiet quitting. Was that where we were?
Yeah, well, we started off on that, but you've triggered something there. You've mentioned something there that I've never heard before. This anticipatory stress, the realization that something might be coming in because this is likely the norm of the way I interact with my colleagues or my boss. What can we do as leaders? And I'm guilty as charged here, but what can we do as leaders to model the behavior that we want to see amongst our team to ultimately seed higher productivity levels and, I suppose, a higher level of joy and flow and ease within the workplace?
Yeah, I think the first thing that leaders need to do to change that is to recognize how much influence you have. The way that I describe this to my leadership clients is that you, just by the very nature of being the boss, you are distracting, and you're like the cop who pulls up behind you on the highway, right? You're driving down the highway and suddenly there's a cop in your rearview mirror, and aren't you hyper, right? Like hyper aware. What's my speed? Is my blinker on? Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? What lane am I in? What speed was I doing? Hang up the phone, turn down the radio. You are just like hyper aware, and you're just waiting. What's he going to do? What's he going to do? What's he going to do? Until he passes you. And I was just doing a leadership session, and some people in the room were former state troopers. And I was like, come on, admit it, you do that. And they were like, 100% we do that. and that's what, right? When the boss is present physically or virtually, the employees are on hyper alert for that. And so recognize, and not only is the employee on hyper alert for that, that's that anticipatory stress, but so is the family. Because any sort of message from the boss could blow up, who knows what, could blow up the plans, could blow up our livelihood. Are you getting fired tomorrow? Like, I don't know what's right. And so leaders, in my experience, vastly underestimate how much influence they have over their employees. And so when you think about how much influence you have, not only over your employees, but over your employees' families, and really, if you influence people and you influence families, then you influence communities, then you influence the world, right? And so if leaders really start to realize how much influence they truly have, then that, I believe, begins to change their behavior in many positive ways for the employees.
Yeah, that resonates so strongly. Our approach is very much, when we're coaching CEOs, leaders of SMEs through a program, it's lead self first before you lead others, before you lead the organization. And it's like dropping a pebble into a pond. It just has this ripple effect for everyone who comes into contact with you, either directly or indirectly. But there's another aspect of this, as you're saying, as you're articulating the anticipatory stress. And I love the metaphor of the cop that's lurking behind you, and that is invariably not particularly beneficial to our nervous system, and ultimately is going to create a level of stress that isn't sustainable for a scaling organization. Can you describe what is great when it comes to an organization where everyone wants to work? Describe that organization for us.
Sure. It is an organization where there are many components where business primarily happens, for the most part, during business hours, whatever those are. And I think, so I articulate a lot of what I call unconscious calculations in the book. An unconscious calculation is something that we appear to believe based on our behavior, but we have never actually looked at it and examined it, right? So for example, we have an unconscious calculation that, I mean, business hours are 24/7. It's business hours somewhere in the world. And when you have global companies, every hour is business hours. Well, it is true that your company can operate globally, but your people cannot work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So you need to set up your company systems so that if your company needs to continue to operate 24 hours a day, then there is some sort of handoff. I'm going home now, and now it's your responsibility to take over. The company can operate 24/7, but the people have to work in shifts. And even knowledge workers, even people who work at a computer, have to work in shifts. They still can't work 24 hours a day. And I think leaders set this tone because they think, well, but I'm the boss, so I always have to be available. And so if the boss is behaving in a way that he or she always has to be available, then that sets the tone for the rest of the company. Well, the way the boss operates is the way I should operate. And so we have this unconscious calculation that we all have to be on all the time. And that is not a place where everyone wants to work. It's one of the many components.
Go through kind of a number of these. So, the business must be transacted during normal hours, and whatever that normal means to you. It's you defining what those are, and then others respecting those.
Yes, I mean, emergencies happen and people should be available in an emergency. But that leads to another problem, which is that even during business hours, most companies have what I call a culture of urgency, where we don't really have a bat signal if there's an emergency, right? Emergencies happen and get conveyed the same way everything else gets conveyed, right? And so any email, any chat message, any text, any voicemail, any message might be a critical emergency. And so if any message might be a critical emergency, then I have to treat every message as if it is a critical emergency until I know that it isn't. And that speeds everything up because we have to monitor, for example, every message as it arrives. Well, most people get a message every 30 seconds. And so if you have to monitor messages every 30 seconds when they come in fact, that's new research from Gloria Mark at UC Irvine. Dr. Mark's research shows that when we are sitting on our computer, we change the screen that we look at about every 47 seconds. And so how can you, especially for the people who get paid essentially to think, how do you apply yourself thoughtfully to your thinking work, to your knowledge work, where you have to be creative and innovative and accurate, right? How do you do that in 47-second increments? And the answer is you can't. And so we need to create guidelines for how we communicate as an organization so that we can operate like day-to-day normal business operations. I can be away from my email for a couple hours or overnight, because if there's an emergency, I'll get a phone call, or for example, or whatever that is, right? But we have this culture of urgency that really speeds things up and increases the pressure. Because, I mean, think about it. You're sitting there at your computer and there's some part of your brain knowing there's an emergency lurking somewhere, and I need to make sure I'm not missing it, right? or what we call an emergency. There really isn't an emergency, but it's like the boss needs something right away is like the emergency. Meanwhile, the boss doesn't even know that she's creating that sort of culture, right? And so that's another challenge. A third challenge is that we don't appreciate that knowledge work requires deep thinking time, right? We can't muster the full range of not only our knowledge and our wisdom and our experience and our critical thinking and our problem solving abilities. We can't muster not only that, but we also can't muster the full range of our humor and our diplomacy and our tact and our writing skills, our communication, right? We are not our best selves in 47-second increments. And we hire people for those very skills, right? Their ability to think, their knowledge, their experience, their problem solving ability, their personality, their humor, their diplomacy, their communication skills. That is what we hire them for. And then we put them in a situation where they cannot apply those things that we hired them for because we get no time. We don't appreciate the thought that knowledge work requires, the deep thinking time that knowledge work requires. And not only that, but like the mind wandering that knowledge work requires, right? Because we often have our most useful insights when we're not actively thinking about a thing, right? When you're like staring at the window, looking at the clouds and you're like, oh, right. So and that's another problem that we create, another unconscious calculation.
That resonates so strongly. I always say to leaders, you know, they're not getting paid for the doing, they're getting paid for the thinking. You know, what's the perfect environment? What's the perfect setup to ensure that actually we're creating space to really leverage what is the greatest asset within our business, which is that creative capacity, that imaginative functioning of our talented workforce?
Yeah. And it's really the flip side of another like problem that we create that creates an environment where people don't want to work, which is that most companies do not have information inside companies is not transparent and accessible, not because anybody's trying to hide it. It's just because we aren't thoughtful and intentional about the way work comes into our organization and flows through our organization. And so as a result, everybody's job pretty much lives in their head. And so any information that somebody needs to do their job lives in somebody else's head. And so the only way I can get the information I need to do my job is to ask somebody. And asking somebody means I need to communicate with them, which means a chat, a phone call, an email, right? A meeting. And so we have so much synchronous communication inside companies. And what I help my clients with, the goal that we work toward is that everyone in your company could, not that they should, but that they could put their head down and work for days without having to communicate with anyone else. If you could put your head down and, in theory, work for days without having to communicate with anyone else, think about how efficiently your company's running. Anything anybody needs to do their jobs is organized and accessible to them. And when we communicate synchronously, we can be very intentional about it. Why are we having this meeting? What do we need to talk about? It's not because my projects are all held up because you're the only one who knows what's going on in those projects. It's because we need to solve a problem that came up with this project, for example. And so helping companies move to more asynchronous communication and less synchronous communication helps the company run more efficiently and reduces both reduces the volume of communication inside the organization and also increases the efficiency of the communication inside the organization. So that's another problem.
I think this is critical, especially when it comes to now enabling productive hybrid working environments. Yeah. It's the understanding we've flipped from kind of what was, we all, trooped into a workplace, a building, we stayed there normally between the hours of 9 to 5, we came back home, that all changed in the pandemic. And then we now have this kind of gradual kind of move back to the workplace, but not wanting to move back fully, so there's it's kind of all in a big pot, and it's a little bit messy at the moment in terms of what are the rules, what are the boundaries, how can we set up our working environments to leverage the wonderful talent that we have within our organization and ensure that we're productive. What have you seen, Maura, as an exemplar of kind of the new working environment, and what would you say to those leaders who are listening in terms of taking practical steps from this podcast to actually begin setting up and creating a culture that sees wonderful productivity, respects boundaries, leverages the talent? Can you speak to that? What would you say to that?
Yes. The first thing that leaders need to think about is how, if you're the CEO, you have to think about, how does work flow through our company? How do we receive work? Is it a thoughtful, systematic process for how work flows through our company? So for example, if your company builds things, you very likely create a very systematic assembly line. We get the work, we create the work order, we build the thing, it goes through the steps to the finished product and out the door. And everybody on the team has a role to get that product from order to out the door. Well, just because you're not building something tangible, you still have essentially, we take in some sort of request for business and we execute and deliver something. And so what happens in between? And for knowledge work, there often is no real, it comes in at the customer service person and they enter the order, and then people take it and do things with it, and then right? But most workers, knowledge workers too, right? Their work comes to them through some ad hoc pile of communication that comes at them every day. Most people go to work every day and do whatever happens to them. Yeah. Right? I'm going to open my email.
That's it. Yeah, it's guided and dictated by what's in their inbox.
What's in their multiple inboxes, right? Their voicemail, their chat boxes, their DMs, and their email. And then, so I deal with all of that incoming message, and then I go to meetings all day, and then I deal with the messages in between, and then I go home at the end of the day, like trying to stay on top. Like I tried to stay on top of all that communication, and I went to all the meetings I was supposed to go to. My to-do list just keeps getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And leaders compound this problem by saying things like, well, we need to be timely with our responses, or we need to be responsive to clients. And that's not a bad thing to say, but if every message that I get might be a message from a client, then I just have to keep monitoring that. And then how do I thoughtfully do the work that our clients are paying us to do, if I just have to keep monitoring for the incoming messages? And so it makes it impossible for employees to prioritize their work and to figure out how do I walk this line between answering communication and being responsive like everybody says I need to be, but also I got all this work to do. And this unconscious calculation that we make is, well, the only time I can do this work is when nobody's bothering me, right? When nobody's interrupting me, when nobody's messaging me. Well, the only time that ever happens, if you're lucky, is after hours, right? Early morning, late at night, weekends. And so people make this unconscious calculation that, well, the only way to really get my job done is to work after hours. And it's unconscious because I don't think anybody wakes up on Monday morning and intentionally says, I can't wait to work every night this week and all weekend also, right? No, nobody says that. It just happens.
And I think that there's a couple of things that are going on here. We've come from a paradigm of the way that work has been structured, probably said in the last 100 years, where people went into factories and they built things, and you could measure productivity. You could certainly manage employees because you could see them; they were all in one building, and you could measure productivity because there was zero produced at the start of the shift, and at the end of the shift there's 100 of these widgets now produced, right. And you can and you start to tweak with productivity levels then to say, well, what if we changed the orientation of this assembly line, and we might be able to get 105 widgets produced at the end of the day. We've got this situation now where that's the paradigm, that's what we've been conditioned, the unconscious conditioning, the subconscious conditioning has lots of managers and leaders programmed that way. We now have this situation where the knowledge workers are largely working from home, but they're being led by managers and leaders who have this paradigm that you should be in the workplace because I'm paranoid that you're not being productive if I can't see that you're sitting in your chair. So if I can't see that you're sitting in your chair, I'm going to ring you and message you lots during the day to make sure you actually are sitting in your chair. So you've got this situation that's happening, this dance. How do we break that and actually get to a point where we're comfortable as leaders that our teams are being productive and accountable for what it is that has to be done?
Yes. It comes back to that the ability for each person on your team. So we have to figure out how work flows through our department, right? If you're just a department manager, or our larger section of the organization, or the whole organization, how does work flow through? What is the highest and best use of each person's time? And let's make sure that they know that. So if I understand that my most important job is to say, create proposals, then I might be more comfortable not monitoring for new customer requests, because I've got this pile of proposals that I have to create. So I feel a little bit more comfortable going off my email. I mean, for an hour, for 90 minutes. I'm not saying people should go dark for days at a time, right? But I might take an hour, knock out a couple of proposals, and feel okay with that if I know that that is my outcome. So a long way to say we need results-based productivity measures. And because you can't touch or count knowledge worker outputs, right? Because knowledge worker outputs are brain activities, communication and ideas and solutions to problems and collaboration and those kind of things. So we can't touch and count them like we can on the assembly line. So we need to identify how is a knowledge worker productive at the end of the day? And honestly, there's a lot of work going on about how to figure out this, but the way I do it, I feel like, is just pretty easy. If you ask people at the end of the day, do you feel like you got a lot done today? If they say yes, they probably did. Now, if you're the boss and you're asking that question, they're always going to say yes, they did, right? So you have to sort of think about that. But But if somebody feels like that was a really good day, I got a lot done today, they probably did, because the very definition of productive from the dictionary is achieving significant results. Significant is the key there, right? Achieving significant results. How productive you are is how much progress you have made on the results that are significant to you. And so in the moment, it feels like, oh, I made my inbox go from 8,172 unread messages to 8,171 unread messages, right? In the moment, it feels like a tiny check, like I did that. But at the end of the day, it adds up to nothing. And so that's why, because we spend our days trying desperately to stay on top of our communication, we don't have time to do any of the real work that we get paid to do. And so when leaders can figure out how work flows through their organization and then can create those most important outcomes for each job role, then people can better prioritize. It's okay that I close my email for an hour, because my primary job is not to take in these problems. My primary job is to crank out these proposals, for example. Right.
Yeah, and this speaks to the fifth principle of our ScaleX framework, which is process and systems, and understanding. To use David Jennings, who wrote the wonderful book called Systemology, who we had in the show in some of the earlier seasons, understanding your critical client flow, how that work actually flows through the organization. As you were articulating that, more of that came into my head. You've mentioned communication a number of times. What can organizations do to communicate externally that they're a company, they are an organization where everyone would want to work? And I say that because access to talent is one of the top three impediments to why companies really struggle to scale. Access to finance, access to new markets are the other two. So what messages should the leaders listening be putting out there in relation to their organization?
Yeah. So we need to do it internally. And then once we get it down internally, we can do it externally, although the two are not mutually exclusive. But one of the things that I help my clients figure out is the guidelines for communication. One of the biggest challenges that people that companies face is that we keep introducing new ways to communicate. And if you think about it, not just like a text message, although we have many, many ways to communicate, but also like, well, now we have a CRM. And so if you want to communicate what happened on your sales call, you enter it into this CRM so that other people can receive it, right? So that's a form of communication. So we have all these different ways to communicate, but we never tell the team, this is what you do in this situation, and this is what you do in this situation, right? Routine requests that don't require an immediate response go through email, for example. Sensitive subjects or complex subjects, we should have a meeting. Urgent phone call or text, for example, right? So creating and it's never perfect and it never works 100% of the time, but if you have some guidelines, then you can understand, what do I need to monitor and what is it okay to be away from for a little bit? So working on that internally with the team, and then you can also teach your customers the same thing. So in the software industry, they have something called SLAs, service level agreements. I don't see any reason why every single company should not have service level agreements. When you take on a new customer, going back to your systems, right? This is how we do business, right? This is how we operate. If you need us, we are there for you, but you have to do this so that we know that it's an emergency, right? And this is how we communicate for routine stuff. And this is where you can see the status of your project. And like, this is how we operate. And if you're going to do business with us, you need to understand how we operate. And so internally creating systems, but also systems with customers, because we all say, oh, well, the customer dictates. The customer doesn't have to dictate, especially if you are differentiating yourself on something other than speed.
It's great advice. I love the I love the suggestion of having the guidelines around the different types of communications, the kind of the hierarchy of what's important or not. Informal communication. I'm just thinking as we speak, informal communications in our own organization are typically through WhatsApp. Very quick messages. The more important formal communications are through email. We have a CRM. But we haven't actually established or set out guidelines, and we're just a small team. In the previous organization, there were lots of different channels by which we were communicating, but we never actually had guidelines. So team members were being kind of bombarded with communications from lots of different sides. My sense of this is that focus is the ability to focus, and the ability to model focus and create an environment for your team to focus and do that deep work is the new superpower for organizations. Have you any guidelines in terms of how we should structure our day? Is there an optimum way to actually manage communications? Should we be switching off our phones for 4 hours a day? Should I close my inbox down? Should I be carving out 2 hours a day for that kind of thinking time where I'm only focused on the kind of the vision for the organization? Is there any optimum structure, Maura?
Yes and no. So everybody's job is different. So, for example, if you are the office manager, your day is probably going to look different than the CEO, right? So everybody's job is different. So from that perspective, not really. There's not an optimum way. But when it comes to how do we work optimally, research shows that we can sustain our attention for anywhere, it's a big range, but somewhere between 25 and 75 minutes. Now, that's kind of an average, right? We can maintain something like you could get lost in some sort of planning for hours. And if that's how you feel, then that's great. And you should keep going. But often after 75 minutes, we start to think about, I've been away from email for a while, and I wonder if anybody needs me, or my shoulder is kind of stiff because I've been sitting here so long, or I need to use the restroom, or I need another cup of coffee, or blah, blah, whatever, right? So the first thing, there's a whole bunch of things that we can think about when it comes to how do we work optimally. The first thing that I would say, though, is that we work optimally when we can make decisions about when we switch our attention. So you use the word focus, and I think focus is the new superpower. I have a phrase that you probably know I like to use. It was the title of my third book, Attention Management, which goes beyond just focus. The ability to focus is a piece of managing your attention, but the real goal of attention management, which encompasses many different brain states, daydreaming, focusing, flow, being in that sort of attention shifting state, which we need sometimes. So the ultimate goal of the practice of attention management is giving you the ability to make mindful choices about what gets your attention, instead of just, so the way I think about it is we run our days with intention and choice, instead of just being reactive and distracted all day long. And research shows that when we can make decisions about what we switch our attention to and when we switch it, we feel more in control, and our stress goes down, and we do better work, and all of those kinds of things. So to a certain extent, batching is a good first step, right? Check your communication as often as you feel like you need to, but do it in between other things, not during other things.
Yeah, very good. Great advice. And and I always say that vision drives decision. You know, if you don't know where you're going, and it's that classic phrase, any road will take you there. And it's understanding that, you know, what you're doing now should be informed by some vision that you have of the future. And you draw that kind of line, that kind of reverse engineer from there. On that basis, do you recommend kind of an evening routine to prioritize what you're going to do the next day, you know, bar an emergency, as opposed to kind of wandering blind into the next day, lifting up the lid of the laptop, opening up the inbox, and there you go. That's your day directed now by virtue of what's sitting in that inbox. Have you got an evening recommendation?
Not for the evening, because the evening is for downtime, not for planning your next day's work.
No, okay, right. That's interesting.
But here's what I would say. I think that managing your work and planning your work is a thing that is what your work day, it is the foundation of your work day. It is not a static thing, it is a dynamic thing. And so this is another piece that is missing. Most people don't realize that not only can the company systematize the way that the company operates, but each individual can systematize the way they work, which I call workflow management. You could also think of it as life flow management, because it's not just about work, it's how we do all the things we need to do in our lives. And I don't mean, a lot of people in the tech industry, if you say workflow management, they think you mean apps or software. I don't mean technology at all. I mean the collection of habits and behaviors that we have. So for example, if your habit is to read every email as it arrives, delete it if you can, deal with it if you can really quick, but then add a flag to it if you can't deal with it right now. That's your habit, right? That's one of the things I'm talking about. If you take a notebook into every meeting with you and you write all the things from the meeting in that notebook, and that notebook is kind of how you figure out how you do things, that's another one of your habits and behaviors. But I mean, down to if you hang your grocery list on the refrigerator, or if you set up your bill pay to pay automatically the same time and you reconcile at the end of the month, right? All of these are the collections of your habits and behaviors. And when I look at my job as shining a light on those habits and behaviors and asking, can this one get more efficient? Can this one get more efficient? Because more efficient means easier. It means easier, less time, less stress. So my earlier books, so really Everyone Wants to Work Here is sort of the culmination from the leadership perspective of the Empowered Productivity series of books that I wrote, which is about personal workflow. How do I manage my day? How do I manage my tasks? How do I manage my communication? How do I manage the meetings that I go to effectively? How do I manage my attention? And so when I have a complete system of how I go through my day, that was kind of the first part of the series. And then we need to look at, well, how do you operate your system in the larger system of how the company operates? And that's where Everyone Wants to Work Here comes in.
Good on you. Before we move into the close, I just want to ask one final question around the importance of learning cultures. You know, I suppose encapsulating everything you're saying is a requirement for leaders to want to change, to want to examine some of the unconscious calculations that exist, to really unpack those, to understand what currently serves them and what won't serve them in the context of their scaling ambition, and having a willingness to change their habits, their behaviors, those things that aren't serving the organization, that aren't respecting certain boundaries, that aren't seeding the productivity which they desire, which is a requirement of a scaling organization. How important is learning, and that kind of seeding, that baking that learning into the culture in the context of creating an organization where everyone wants to work?
Every leader I talk to says that they want people who have a growth mindset, right? Who are open to learning and open to changing. And then the problem that right, and the reason that it's easier said than done is because when we start to confront, when I shine a light on for my clients, right, whether it's on the way they personally are operating or whether the way the company is operating, what we discover is that some of those changes are hard to make. And a lot of leaders, especially in scaling organizations, they're so involved in the day-to-day that they just don't have that opportunity. Like, in theory, I would love to change the way work flows through my department, but I'm too busy doing the work that's coming through my department to think about how to kind of restructure everything. And I'm already overwhelmed and I'm already exhausted. And that is just not a hill I'm willing to climb, is what happens. And so one of the things that I tell my clients is leaders need to think about their role as being less about not being the person who fights the fires, but being the person who prevents the fires from happening in the first place. Yeah. And the only way you can do that is if you take that higher level view and spend at least some of your time out of the day-to-day looking at how things are happening and making changes, even though they're hard and they take a while, and being willing to tackle those big things is hard. It's hard, but it's critical.
Yeah, profound advice there. It speaks to the message coming from Michael Gerber's very famous book, The E-Myth, and he spoke to the importance of working on the business and not in the business. And we characterize 5 stereotypes of those who don't achieve scaling, and one of them is the dead man walking, that person who literally walks themselves into to their own prison cell. They every day they're kind of entrenching themselves and getting deeper into the bowels of the business, which makes it more difficult to actually extract themselves and look at what's happening and work on the business as opposed to directly in it. So, Maura, the last hour has absolutely flown. That's been a really enjoyable, wonderful conversation. Congratulations on your 6th book. I wonder, will you recall the last time I posed this question? It's been 2 years actually since we last spoke, almost 2 years since we last spoke. And I always ask our guests to share with the listeners 3 timeless takeaways. It'll be interesting to see if these have changed from the last time. Can you share with our listeners 3 timeless takeaways, Maura?
Timeless takeaways for them from this conversation?
For anything forgiven. I mean, you have the real privilege, and you've worked hard to have that privilege of working with some of the most esteemed organizations on the planet. You're working with CEOs, business leaders every day. You have a wonderful life that's rich with lots of experiences. So in any facet, whether it be work life, personal life.
Sure. So the first thing is, for anyone at any level of the organization, we need to remember that the things that we give our attention to determine the direction of our lives. And so, and nobody gets to decide except us what gets our attention. Now, it's harder in theory, it's harder to practice than it is in theory, but we truly have complete control. And that's why I call my system empowered productivity, right? Because nobody can manage your work except you. No one can control your attention except you. No one can give you work-life balance. You must take it. We truly, even though it doesn't feel like it a lot of the time, we truly have say over how our days go. And we just need to claim that and recognize that. So that message of empowerment is the first thing. For leaders, the second takeaway I would say is to really recognize how much influence you have and wield that influence wisely, because you really have way more impact on employees' lives, which means you impact their families, which means you impact their kids, which means you have so much influence. So wield that wisely. And then I guess the last thing that's on my mind, that because you talk about people who are in the business rather than working on the business, there's one simple phrase that I think if leaders used more often, they would be less distracted and their teams would learn and grow and take more ownership and have more productive days. And that phrase for leaders to use is, I trust your judgment.
Very powerful and wonderful, wonderful advice to our listeners. If there's one thing that you can do when you stop listening to the podcast, is look around your team and seek out a team member where you can actually impart those words, where you can communicate those words. I trust your judgment, or certainly be very mindful of the next time that someone comes to you, maybe seeking your advice. Ask them what they're thinking, and certainly articulate back to them that I trust your judgment. That's very powerful. Maura, I assume you're taking a little bit of a rest now that you've just completed your 6th book and launched it, but what is next for you?
My agent keeps asking me the same question. I'm not sure. More of the same, I think. I've been working a lot, doing a lot of leadership retreats, and spending a lot of time with leaders. And it's really rewarding because it really does change the lives of their employees. When they take some of this information and they change the way they interact with employees, it changes the company culture, and that changes their employees' lives, which changes their employees' families' lives, which means that they have more to give. Those employees have more to give to their families and to their communities. And so it makes this huge impact on the world. And so more of that. Of that.
Good on you. We're very, very aligned on that. Maura, if people want to connect with you and find out a little bit more about your work, where best to reach you?
Thanks. My website, maurathomas.com, is the best place to start. And if you would allow me a little plug, Brendan, if there's anybody listening to this podcast who hasn't read your book yet, the thing that is so profound about your book to me, for businesses of all sizes, is that it really is so simple. There are other books about scaling, and they're really hard. They're very heavy, and they're very dense, and they're very complex. And what I love about yours is that it just boils it down. It doesn't matter your company size. If you want to grow, the steps really are so simple. And that's what I think is so powerful about your business. So about your book. So if there's anybody listening who hasn't read it yet and wants to grow a business, you need to add it to your list.
Oh, Maura, that is so, so kind of you. I wasn't expecting that. I really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
I can tell you're blushing.
I am. I am. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And right back at you as well. Look, I want to thank you for your time, your wisdom, and your wonderful energy as ever. It hasn't changed. You've amped it up even since the last time we spoke. It's great to see. I've really, really enjoyed the conversation today. Take care.
Me too. Thanks, Brendan.